we'd hoped to get more perspectives, but our invitations were met with some resistance for reasons we don't need to go into now. But happily, we've engaged the creative mind of Jakob Wheeler, and who is the round of applause over here, editor and publisher of the Glen Arbor Sun. Now, you all probably know that Jakob began the Sun when he was 18 years old. He's a native of Denmark, an award-winning journalist and author who has filed stories from 5 different continents. The Glen Arbor Sun has covered the events, characters, businesses, politics, and arts of Leelanau County since 1996. It's published every other week during the summer and on a monthly basis during the shoulder seasons. Interestingly, I think, Jakob also works with student journalists at Northwestern Michigan College in Traverse City, where he lives with his wife, Sarah, daughter, Nina, and son, Leo. We welcome Jakob, and I would like to say that you only have to look at the cover page of this week's Glen Arbor Sun to see how this publication addresses this actual issue. From tariff boycotts and supply shortages to a review of an exhibit that questions the long history of artistic patriarchy, to a footer that reads, "The ink on this newspaper was forged in the fight against lies and authoritarianism." Jakob, who wrote that?
The lies and authoritarianism?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I confess ignorance.
It's a good one.
I don't know. I think, when Trump won the last year's election, and when it became clear that, those of us in news and reporting were really going to have to buckle down and state and defend the truth, I began looking at, I don't know. I mean, I think like all of us, I've long thought, does this represent a slide into authoritarianism, or not yet, or even the big F word, fascism? I've always been inspired by, I think it was Woody Guthrie's quote, about his guitar, his music fighting fascism. I'm not willing to use the fascism word, but I think that certainly the lies and the threat of authoritarianism coming from on high is very real. And, we all, as citizens and civic people, as Americans, have rules to play. And for me, as a journalist, it's stating and protecting and harping on the truth.
Indeed. So, looking at my notes here, you're kind of in a unique situation in that you're both the editor and the publisher of this publication, and therefore you can pretty much do what you want.
Yeah, it's a dangerous place to be.
It's a brave place to be. How do you, in the course of a week or two, how do you go about choosing and finding the balance between what you want to say about what's happening nationally?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I'm very grateful to have a wonderful community in Leelanau County. Long was Glen Arbor Empire, and now is the whole county, to support the paper. The Glen Arbor Sun is free to read, both in print and online, and funded through advertising. So business community support. There are a lot of places where journalism is dying, but not here, and not in this region. I mean, we have rich journalism, many outlets coming from different angles and perspectives, but we have really a wealth of good journalism in Northwest Lower Michigan and Leelanau, Grand Traverse County. So I feel lucky to be in that ecosystem, and I feel very lucky to have fantastic writers. Katie, I think you're there, Katie Dunn, among them, and others who have really jumped in and dug into stories that they care about, but also, I believe, play a really proactive role in the community in fostering and leading debate. I mean, Katie's story in our most recent edition that you alluded to about the exhibit at the Glen Arbor Arts Center, which is ongoing, Whose Voice, and really a history in the Western world going back centuries of women artists being silenced. That's the kind of story that's very relevant now. It's always been relevant. And of course, whenever we have a local event or initiative, or in this case, an exhibit, that we can tie, we can back up with a broader story. That's key. I mean, that's golden for a newspaper editor.
So you've certainly done that this week and have a long history of that. Um, are there stories right now that you're thinking about that need to be told?
Hmm. I think that many journalists would say that, since the most recent election and since Trump took power again in January, it's been drinking from the fire hose. Change has happened so quickly, so fast. We try to cover it all. We can't cover it all, especially an operation as small as ours. I've tried to, throughout this year, dive into different topics at different times. Carrie, I'm looking back to the links I sent you, like 20 of them, of our coverage really since last October, our edition prior to the Trump-Harris election. It looks like, last winter, before and immediately after the election, I kind of dug into coverage of immigration, the immigration debate, and threats, perceived threats, fear among our farm worker, our immigrant community. It's important to state that I know of no mass roundups yet of of our farm worker community in Leelanau County. But that said, we know it's happening a lot of other places, certainly in big cities. The all the South Koreans nabbed at the plant in Georgia recently. Um, Hmong and Laotians picked up in Detroit a little while ago. The fear is there. The fear is palpable, and I think throughout all of this, the fear among our local migrant farm worker community has been palpable. What I didn't see coming, and maybe I should have read the tea leaves a bit more, but what I didn't see coming, and I think what I devoted some of my stories once we got into February, March, the spring, in the Glen Arbor Sun and elsewhere, was coverage of the of DOGE's cost cutting and fiscal threats to our national parks, also to USAID. That came as a surprise. And so, I kind of intentionally devoted a lot of my time, sometimes at the expense of other stories I wanted to cover, in March and April, really, as Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore and other parks all over the Midwest began gearing to reopen, thus kind of heralding the beginning of our busy tourism season, covering what the hiring freeze, especially for seasonal workers who really make Sleeping Bear Dunes go, what that meant to the national park, to the Sleeping Bear Dunes, and what it would mean, what it could mean for the visitor experience. What was interesting about that type of coverage was, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore Superintendent Scott Tucker, with whom I have a very warm relationship. We correspond via cell phone once in a while. He was, in terms of anything policy related, anything coming from Washington, he was absolutely not able to speak to me or any other journalist during that time. Still is not. But my luck was, I realized pretty quickly that Tom Ulrich, who's now retired, Leelanau County resident, who was Scott's deputy superintendent, thus the second in charge of Sleeping Bear Dunes until he retired 2 years ago, and knows the inner workings of hiring and all the big decisions made at our park. He could speak to me without fear of reprisal from the federal government because he's retired. And so I've had that feather in my cap throughout in attempting to cover what's happening at Sleep Bear Dunes, but yet not being able to speak directly with those who run the park. I've tried to, I've covered, some of the demonstrations that have happened, from the hands-off rallies in April to the No Kings demonstrations. I think in a county as small as Leelanau, when you have huge gatherings centered around one message, that's very worthy of coverage. Also demonstrations bring pageantry and slogans and colors and fun and signs. And that's dynamic to cover as a newspaper person. And we'll continue to do that. But that said, I think for me and for other journalists, it's really important to, in as much as we can, to focus on the issues themselves, the policy more so than the politics. I mean, it's been so easy in the age of Trump, which, we're basically a decade of Trump now, a decade of Trump dominating our national discussions. It's so easy to focus on the politics, the emotions, the personality, the vitriolic, the vitriol, the rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. But it's so important to dig deep and look at the policy. And some of our coverage in the Glen Arbor Sun of policy this year has been, of course, I mentioned coverage of Sleeping Bear Dunes and how DOGE budget cuts and hiring freezes has marred that. How threats from Washington against any diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, forced the Sleeping Bear Dunes really to back away from and not to host the screening of a wonderful film that played a proactive role in making happen, a film by Joe Vandermeulen about Black pioneers who were early settlers around the Glen Lakes. That project came to fruition, and some of the relatives of those Black descendants came back from the South for that screening. It was screened at the Bay Theater. It was later screened at Leland Public High School, but the national park would have played a larger role in that presentation if it hadn't been for this kind of DEI fear. We've covered. I'm looking through a list here. We've covered Canadian boycotts of the U.S. and travel to the U.S. Boycott of American-made products. That's especially a poignant Michigan story because so much of our economy and our neighborliness is with Canada, is with Ontario. We had a story about Pete Farmer and his small business Farmer Foot Drums, and how boycotts from Canadians and also elsewhere has really cut into his profits. We also have published stories about what threats to National Nutrition Education Program and SNAP benefits would mean, and now will mean, now that that program has been cut by Trump and the Republican Congress's big beautiful bill. Occasionally, we've run op-eds that are national political in nature. I was very, very happy to and proud to run an op-ed by Bob Sutherland, Cherry Republic's owner and president, in our 4th of July issue called Life, Liberty, Beaches, and Pie. That's, of course, Cherry Republic's slogan. But the headline was Life, Liberty, Beaches, and Pie for our foreign-born workers, for us all. And in that op-ed, Bob talked about a Central American couple who lives in our community and has worked for Cherry Republic, came here as refugees from a pretty tough political situation in their home country, had work permits to work for Cherry Republic. Those work permits were revoked, and now his company is helping them get by, but they have no income and they can't work for Cherry Republic. These are all just examples of how federal government policies are impacting locals, impacting local businesses, especially a business as iconic as Cherry Republic. We ran a piece about conservation projects slated to happen in Northwest Michigan, in this region, that have been scrapped by the big beautiful bill. And yeah, as you mentioned, Carrie, this week in our September 11th edition, the cover story that I wrote was about tariffs, boycotts, and supply shortages. Oh my. I don't know if anyone picked up on the headline. It was an attempt to play off of the lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Yeah. I love Wizard of Oz. I have a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, so we talk Wizard of Oz lingo quite a bit. That story really was born when I saw, I read a blog post by Jody Hayden, the co-owner of Grocer's Daughter Chocolate and Empire, a blog post that she put out, that she sent to their customers in late July, putting a figure to what the tariffs had meant. That they were paying an extra $20,000 plus on their most recent shipment of Ecuadorian chocolate, because Ecuador has I believe a 10% no, I'm sorry, a 15% tariff on it. But I began to do some digging and found and talk with other businesses, talk with other sectors, learned that, the Leelanau Coffee Roasting Company and likely other coffee suppliers have had to deal with a 50% tariff on Brazilian products. Brazil is the largest source, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps worldwide, of high quality Arabica coffee beans. And that huge tariff has made Brazilian coffee basically, it's unsustainable to buy it or import it to the United States, thus creating a shortage in the coffee supply. And Brazil is interesting, right? Because, what we've read, what's pretty clear is the 50% tariff on Brazilian products versus, say, 10 and 50% for much of the rest of the Western world has everything to do with Trump's, his kind of bromance with Brazilian former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is now facing charges for his alleged role in their own coup, their own kind of January 6, 2021, when he's tried to stay in power 2 years later in 2023. And Trump's upset that they're holding Bolsonaro accountable. So he's levying this huge tariff. My point, I suppose, is we need to try as journalists to focus on policy, and not get chewed up and eaten up by the politics. It's been a very, very hard week in American political discourse. The assassination of Mr. Kirk, and regardless of what we think about his rhetoric and what he stands for, political assassinations are the worst thing that can happen because they don't stop with one bullet and one person. It's really scary. And there's never an excuse for violence or threats of violence from any side. And I think it really reminds us that we have to pull back and we have to be able to talk about politics and how it impacts our lives. And we have to be able to talk about policies and how they impact our lives, but without pitting the other side, the other camp, those who vote differently than us as the boogeyman. And that's what's happening. That's what's been happening, especially in conservative circles since Charlie Kirk was assassinated a few days ago.
In your efforts to make connections with and get a full view of what's going on, would you speak a bit about the collaboration between different journalistic outlets that's happening up here in the region?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's a great thing to talk about. The Northern Michigan Journalism Collaborative or Cooperative was born of an organization that's nationwide called Press Forward, and there's now a chapter called Press Forward Northern Michigan, which really came together through a woman named Elizabeth in Traverse City, who's a former NPR ombudsperson, who now lives in the region. She, a couple years ago, launched a fascinating study. She reached out to power brokers and voices throughout Northwest Lower Michigan to understand the role of the importance of local journalism and the impact of cuts to journalism, the impacts of cuts to publications drying up. This was Elizabeth Jensen. And out of that study came, it came conversations that I was lucky enough to be a part of. And out of that really came a group that was pulled together, especially by Peter Payette at Interlochen Public Radio and the good folks at Bridge, Michigan. We meet about once a month. The Grand Traverse Community Foundation is involved. And the first project that's been funded by Press Forward Northern Michigan is this Northern Michigan Journalism Collaborative. It's led by IPR and led by Bridge. And what it boils down to basically is that all those under the umbrella, which includes the Glen Arbor Sun, we share stories. We share stories of regional relevance. I was lucky enough to have, I think, the first piece that we shared collectively, which was about cuts to national parks coming from Washington, coming from DOJ, and how they would impact the parks and how they would impact the visitor experience. That story ran in May, right around Memorial Day, and it was about Sleeping Bear Dunes and my reporting, but also about Pictured Rocks and Isle Royal, with some reporting by journalists in the UP. But it's powerful. It's powerful to share reporting across a lot of publications. You know, as you would guess, a lot of these stories that we've been publishing throughout this really since late May have been not just about policy and politics, but have been largely, you know, about the Trump administration's moves and the way it's impacted life, commerce, discourse in rural Northern Michigan. Um, you know, I used to say that you had to be creative and look hard to find how national politics impacts life up here. But I think that especially this past year, since January 20th, it's been blatantly obvious. It's been a slap across the face how we're impacted by policy and politics.
Absolutely. In your role at NMC, where you're
Mhm.
helping to educate young journalists, how do you articulate with them going forward at this time where newspapers are closing, where there's so much risk, you know, the negativity that some journalists receive in terms of work that they've produced? How do
Mhm.
you talk to them?
You know, it actually hasn't been as difficult as you make it out to be. And I understand why you're asking the question. I mean, there's always a background fear that we're not going to be able to recruit. Every year, we basically have to recruit a new newspaper staff because NMC is a 2-year college, and so there's constant turnover. That's the nature of this wonderful place. Um, but every year, between 5 and 10 enthusiastic students, you know, some of whom will be journalists, some of whom will not, but they'll use the interviewing and reporting and writing skills for other good use in their future endeavors. But every year we get 5 to 10 who come and are passionate, and either they want to learn how to write or they really care about a certain issue. Um, and so I've been pleasantly surprised that kind of even in this kind of like, you know, quote unquote death or malaise of local journalism, we have passion, we have interest. Last year we had a fantastic staff that I warned them when we began the year last fall at NMC, you know, we're going to have most of the major political candidates coming to town because this is Michigan. And sure enough, between Labor Day and, you know, late October, we had Vance, we had Trump, we had Bernie, um, we had almost everyone. This year, in a way, we're unshackled because we don't have to cover a national election and candidates coming to Traverse City. But what we get to cover are if the students dive into it, it's always their call. It's a student-run newspaper. I'm just there to help. But they pick what we run, what we report on. But I think in a way it's more fun and an opportunity to do a deeper dive in reporting. We get to cover the issues rather than the people, the personalities. Again, let's try to cover the policies rather than the politics. There is an interest this fall among the students. There always is really in covering issues such as the unhoused, what we used to call homelessness, which, you know, is relevant for some students at NMC. I mean, we have those who have lived out of cars or couch surfed who were students at this college before. Um, there's been an interest among my students, perhaps at covering topics about mental health. Um, you know, I think the terrible thing that happened, the mass stabbings at Walmart this summer, really it opened an opportunity for the community, and that means local journalism and reporters to talk about mental health, to talk about issues of homelessness. Yeah, there was no evidence that I've seen that the culprit who committed those stabbings at Walmart ever lived in the Pines in Traverse City. But that said, the Pines were a place where many were cast off and sent or forced to go. They've since been closed. You know, the powers that be, the police, city government have national government, I should say, because the Supreme Court gave the blessing to local governments to close their homeless encampments. So the powers that be, which are across the political spectrum here, have basically said it's okay to do away with your homeless encampments. Where are they all going in Traverse City? And what does that all say about how we collectively, our society, are helping, dealing with people with mental health issues or can't find housing, which of course is tied to the exorbitant cost of trying to find a place to live in this region. Um, these issues are all woven together in one knot. So these are all topics that my students at the White Pine Press and NMC may report on.
Well, we appreciate all those efforts to continue educating us through journalism. And I would like to open this up. Does anybody have questions for Jakob? Let's see, Jeanette wrote, I recently discovered the podcast Question Everything by Brian Reed, which is examining journalism in these times. I spent the summer catching up on all the old episodes. Highly recommended. We'll check it out. Learned a lot about journalism and what's at risk. Our public schools need to be teaching students about journalism, how it works, its rigors, its protections, its value. I would add how the country works as well. Seems to be missing in our children's education.
Is the NMC, thanks, I'm reading Jill's questions. Is the NMC paper involved in the cooperative, in the Northern Michigan Journalism Cooperative that I mentioned? Yes and no. I mean, not officially, because our meetings of the cooperative have been happening through the summer, and the White Pine Press, the student-run paper at NMC, which I advise, is not active during the summer months. We kind of shut down after our mid-April edition, and we're ramping up again now. So not officially. That said, in a way it is. I mean, the White Pine Press and any paper, any publication throughout the region is welcome to run stories, rerun stories produced by the CAP Collaborative. And I'm willing to guess that if my students report or write, a story or cover series of stories that's really dynamic about some of these issues, that others in the collaborative, which includes, again, IPR Bridge, which also includes the Record Eagle and the Leland Enterprise, and of course the Glen Arbor Sun, that hypothetically we could rerun stories that germinated or emanated from student journalism. So the umbrella here with the cooperative is intentionally large. And it's also an attempt to, we admit here that journalists are, and news, whether they're a one-person shop like the Glen Arbor Sun or whether they're newsrooms with 20 people, we're overwhelmed. News happens so fast. For decades now, there's been a pressure to get on the story immediately in the 24/7 news cycle. We're all overwhelmed. And so if we can help out a newsroom, if we can help out a publication by feeding them a story they can republish, that's vetted, that's solid, that shows the impact, the relevance, it's been fact checked. It's really an aid, it's really a help.
Sam, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if your students are concerned about gun policy at NMC.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a couple of years, I think now, but we have I shouldn't say we, because again, I love how I always repeat that it's student run. It's not me. It's not the faculty or staff. It's not adults, right? But my students have run some dynamic coverage in the past about NMC's, this community college's preparedness for a mass shooting, God forbid. What training has been in place, what locks are in place, what buildings can be locked down, how it would go about, how Jim White, the security team, would respond, how quickly or not it would happen. These are really, really important questions, and they're tough questions. I mean, you can imagine how taxing it is for student journalists just to consider these possibilities. The students also, during the mass shooting at Michigan State University a couple of years ago, they wrote dynamic coverage of that as well, connecting it to, this existential threat that faces all places, but especially faces all places of higher learning. Yeah. So yeah, Sam, thanks for that question. They have done that. And, you know, as an adjunct faculty here now, it's eerie, but you know, amid the myriads of trainings, online trainings, you know, FERPA, et cetera, that we have to do every fall at NMC, um, you know, active shooter preparedness is now among them, which it shouldn't have to be that way, but that's the world we live in.
Unfortunately.
Mary, to answer your question, yes, my dear friends Aubrey and Jordan with the Betsy Current in Benzie County, they are also involved in the cooperative. Yes.
Kate, you have a question?
Yeah, so you mentioned the political assassination this week, but one thing we saw after that was some journalists get fired, and other people in higher education get fired, a lot of them making comments that were factually true.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious about if you've seen locally any of that fear of what's being said or retaliation because of the truth, or what that might look like, or even if there's concerns with NMC and what's published, and even though it's a student-run paper, if they've given any guidance or released anything trying to shut down truth.
Thanks for the question. No, I mean, I don't know, like the assassination, it just happened. It's, you know, it's only a couple days old and it's recent. So I haven't really absorbed the impact on the local media sphere yet. You know, obviously the national media sphere moves a lot faster, too fast in a way, because when you have things flying every second, there's no opportunity for reflection and analysis. I haven't really seen or felt what it means locally. And again, the new semester just began at NMC a couple weeks ago. The students will publish their first edition of the White Pine Press 2 weeks from now. So we start a bit more slowly. You know, we had a really dynamic story that we published last spring about a young man on campus, a dynamic, ambitious young man on campus who started a local conservatives. And I'm sorry, I don't recall if the name used conservatives or Republicans, but it was essentially a young Republicans group on campus which hadn't existed before. And you know, it would be interesting, I suppose, for the writer of that story who's still on our staff to go back and speak with him and talk about, you know, what did Charlie Kirk mean to him, and what does he feel like it means, you know, to lead a conservative organization on a college campus, and any college campus? Because, you know, I mean, part of the conversation about Kirk, right, is that, I mean, it is clear that you know, institutes of higher learning, college campuses are by and large progressive, are by and large liberal. And I think there's an interesting conversation that comes of how do you, you know, how do you foster, how do you invite legitimate, capital L legitimate debate about issues on campus without making conservatives feel like they don't have a voice and can't speak, but without of course letting in hate speech, right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, one thing that is crazy is that the assassin, the shooter, was more alt-right than Kirk. So it was not a left on right. You know, it was a extreme right on slightly less extreme right. And I feel like, but there's so much bashing. And I would say that as far as if anything's felt locally, you know, like I said, the local Democrat Party was worried about people's safety, and they asked us not to do pop-ups this week. And when I went to the one on Friday, it was fine, but there were multiple people that stopped and, you know, were talking about Kirk, not talking about this alt-right assassin that was found. And also there was a sheriff car up the road, which was the first time that I've seen a sheriff car up the road from that particular pop-up. So I do feel like it's having an effect locally.
Where was this? Which town?
In Cedar,
In Cedar.
the Friday pop-up.
So here's the thing. I mean, when something awful like this happens, a political assassination, Charlie Kirk, you know, in some ways it represents how we've collectively hyper focused politics on turning the other side into the boogeyman, and we're focused on gross stereotypes and personality. We're not talking about policies, right? And I get that policies is a boring thing to talk about. It's not as dynamic as talking about politics. And during an election year, it's certainly not as dynamic as talking about, the candidates and the people, right? I mean, it's an easier story to tell to talk about the people. But what impacts our lives are the policies, are what comes down from Washington, or the rhetoric that's espoused by the commander-in-chief, and how that impacts our lives. We need to be able to, even in the days after a political assassination, and this caustic dialogue and these calls for retribution, which are scary. We need to not be afraid to continue talking about the policies of the government and the policies of these leaders. And yeah, also the policy implications coming from some of the things that Charlie Kirk has said. Let's talk about the policies rather than the people, if we can. I'll say that, see, he was assassinated on, was it Wednesday? It was Wednesday, right? So I had gone to press with this week's issue of the Glen Arbor Sun late Tuesday night. And then the paper was delivered and came out on Thursday. And of course, I knew that the front page, top of the fold story was about tariffs. And obviously it was implicitly critical of Trump's policies. I was a little relieved that story was about policy and not about personality of Trump or anyone in his orbit. Because, I mean, would I have thought about not distributing it if it was a story about personality? I don't know, probably not, but it's really important that we focus on what actually matters, what actually impacts our lives. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Do you feel like using the word policy versus politics? Because I find policy is under the umbrella of politics, but you seem to think they're very different. How do you silo those?
Well, they're of course married. I mean, policies come from politics is the art of campaigning, and it's the art of articulating or bashing policies, right? But the policies are the impacts. I wish that, if you look at too many and probably most debates in modern American political history, there's not enough on the policy. I mean, Trump and Kamala Harris is one debate. There was focus on, eating dogs in Ohio, and there was focus on the size of rallies at Trump rallies. And I understand why Harris went there. She's trying to get under his skin, but we didn't hear climate change mentioned once, I don't think.
No.
We're not focusing on the most important policy issues of our time, and that's really sad. We've got to lead, as journalists, as publishers, as citizens, we've got to lead our communities back to where we can talk about the policies and the impacts of those policies on our world, our nation, our county.
We have 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to stop because it's getting late. And I'm going to suggest everybody comes to a social so we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of that. Jakob, thank you. This is fascinating.
Jared
Thank you.
has
The
his hand up.
politics and policy relationship. I wonder if you could talk about your responsibility as a producer of news and our responsibility as consumers when we're confronted by questionable data, misrepresentations. We can say allegedly this, or but even in a local level, we sat for the last couple of years that I've been a resident of Leelanau, heard that the county wasted $1 million on hiring things. I could never figure out what this meant. So I'm kind of asking how we address policy in an age where data seems to be increasingly politicized.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you for asking. It's also hard. Well, we need to call out when numbers or facts are shared that are incorrect. You know, that's easier for me to do because I you know, spend money on ink on newsprint, and so I can add in parentheses or in a sentence, you know, actually blah 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 was the actual number, or blah 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 was the actual whatever, or actually, you know, native born white US citizens are more likely to commit heinous crimes than immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. I can add that because I have a forum. It's more difficult for you to do if you're engaged in a conversation / argument with someone on the other side at a Leelanau County board meeting or whatever, because people just tune out. But we have to. I mean, we have to correct lies, inaccuracies. I mean, in terms of discourse and the time-honored way to show someone with whom you disagree respect, but perhaps get through to them, has always been the Socratic method, right? Ask them questions. Ask them questions in a non-threatening way. Ask them questions, you know, why do you think that, and I'm just making this up here, but, you know, why do you think that immigrants are more dangerous than quote unquote American citizens? I mean, the Socratic method in tone is a great way to show deference to someone in the way you're asking them, but to really put it back to them, to give them their soapbox for one more second, and then let them defend why they espouse that view. And maybe using the Socratic method is a way to help people correct or at least examine their own lies they've just espoused. Don't know if that helps.
No,
Sorry.
thank you. If I can take 20 more seconds, I hope that someone locally will look at all the changes brought about by DOGE in terms of hiring people at the park and being able to charge fees for users. Because when I go by the dune climb, which I do at least 3 or 4 times a week, it's rarely populated by anyone in the booth.
Sure.
And it will be easy at the end to say, oh, well, people don't value the park. They didn't visit. They didn't, you know, our counts of the number of users reflected in the fees paid is a huge reduction when I'm not sure that's true. Anyways, thank you very much.
Yeah, you know, the national park story, I mean, it's hard to glean, you know, it's hard to glean from visitor statistics how much our national park means to us. I mean, obviously there are studies every once in a while that look at the economic impact on businesses. You know, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I think one of the really the biggest worry, and this is a down the road worry, we won't unfortunately know it until we've got there, but the worry is, you know, the DOGE approach is cut back on parks and other institutions to the point where they can't perform at the high level they used to. Maybe you even privatize certain services. And then we lose America's best idea. We lose our national parks. There's a real worry that if you cut them down to size and then privatize certain services, we won't have what we used to have.
Thank you.
Jerry, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm full of admiration for Yakov and the job he and his colleagues do. It's extraordinary. But one of the things we seem to lack around here is really systematic coverage of local government. And I wonder, you're not in a position to remedy all that, but I wonder if you think the Open Meetings Act needs tweaking, and if so, why?
That's a good question. I'm probably not as well studied in that to answer your question. I will say that transparency in Michigan government leaves a lot to be desired. No matter who is governor of Michigan, whether it's been Rick Snyder or Gretchen Whitmer, every governor and every attorney general for that matter seems to push back on or kick the can down the road on the need for open government, for Freedom of Information Act requests to apply to the executive branch in Lansing as well. That's been a real problem for journalists. It's been we've struggled with whether it's Democrats or Republicans in power to get the executive branch to realize that FOIA requests ought to apply to them as well. So sorry, that's more of a Lansing or state government attempt to answer your your local question. Yeah, but I mean, the Glen Arbor Sun being a bi-weekly, by summer and monthly during the shoulder seasons, we don't have the resources and are not able to cover all the machinations of county government and township government, with the attention that the Leland Enterprise and sometimes the Ticker is able to play. I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful to have other media outlets that are covering everything, covering more than I can. I try to latch on to certain issues or certain developments more than trying to cover everything. In the past, pre-Trump, I suppose I've been more focused on national government, national policies, national politics. But in the past, we've devoted some coverage to early childhood education funding within Leelanau County government, the fights that have happened on the commission over that, and kind of the need for that in Leelanau County.
Hopefully, another publication will be thorough on that front. I can't thank you enough, Jakob, for answering all of our questions, giving us so much to think about. Really appreciate your being here and hope to see you again at times, a more social time where we can talk about this some more with the membership.
Thank you. Thank you all. Please reach out to me if you have story ideas, critiques of our coverage, anything. It's nice to hear warm compliments, but we benefit a lot more from constructive critiques and particular ideas of things we ought to cover and latch onto.
Great. Thanks again.